So now we're in the upper part of the foothills zone, which is one notch above the desert and the sagebrush. There's still sagebrush in that zone, but it starts to be replaced by other mountain forbs and grasses. So in this zone, we start to run into more juniper trees and more conifer trees, mostly limber pine in this area. So one of the plants that's really common, was used quite a lot by Shoshone tradition as food and medicine, probably more medicine than food, is balsam root. And there's two species of it. The one that was used has an entire leaf that's long, about a foot long, and arrow-shaped. So this is called Arrowleaf Balsamroot, Balsamraja sagittata. So balsam rhiza just means balsam root. Sagittata refers to the arrow-shaped leaf. The main thing this was collected for on a regular basis was as a medicine, and that's for this root. The root was taken in the fall usually, and it could be boiled, and somebody that's got a very serious lung congestion could inhale the steam as you do with sagebrush. Sometimes this was mixed with sagebrush leaves and steamed, and the person was asked to put their head over the pot or the buffalo stomach with boiling water in it and inhale the steam deep into the lungs. It does two things. It kills bacteria, and it's an immune stimulant. Also opens up the bronchioles, so it's a dilator, bronchodilator. Works in those ways, which is a perfect combination for treating somebody with pneumonia or some serious lung congestion. Could be due to an allergy. So this is used today. You can buy balsam rhiza salves to rub on your chest when you've got a chest cold, so you can breathe in the vapors constantly. And you also steam it. It's a resin in here that's the active volatile part. When you steam it, that gets into the steam and you inhale it. So that's what the root was used for. These roots could be dried and kept like this and then pounded when they were needed to be used for a patient. But otherwise, it's an edible plant. The roots can be eaten as a survival food. They don't taste very good, but you can boil them for about 24 hours or steam them underground. Sometimes when something had to be cooked a long time, there were trenches dug and red hot rocks rolled into the trench that had been heated in a fire, and then these roots were thrown on top of it, and then big leaves like these sagittata leaves, these balsam root leaves, could be put on top so you could shovel dirt on top of that, and that would keep the heat in, and that way you could cook these roots. Other things were cooked that way for food, like lichens that are hard to cook. They take 12, maybe 20 hours of cooking, and we'll talk about lichens later on. But there's some foods that had to be cooked a long time, and balsam root was probably only your survival food because of the time it took to actually make it palatable. But the stems were eaten. The stems of this plant, which come out in the early spring, the flower stalk, can be peeled to get the hard, kind of thick outer skin off, and then it's a succulent flower stalk underneath, which you can eat like a survival food or a traveling food. Sometimes people call it the fast food of the mountains. And there's a bunch of those plants that you can eat while you're moving. You just bend over and grab a bunch of them, and while you're walking before the horse, you did a lot of walking, just peel the outer skin off of these stems and eat them like trail food. In the fall, the flowers produce seeds, in that central disc of the flower, and those are sunflower seeds, because this plant's in the sunflower family. They're very tiny, so they weren't eaten raw, but they were pounded and cooked into a meal. So that's balsam root. It's not the tastiest plant. It's good medicine. As a food, it's marginal, but it's exceedingly common in this zone, in the upper foothill zone. It's so common that it's hard to get away from it in many places, so that it was always available in the spring of the year. Another one that's common and usually not collected to preserve is this stonecrop. And stonecrop is a tiny plant. It grows about 4 inches tall, maybe 5 inches tall. And it has a yellow flower that's 5-petaled, sharp petals. Very high in vitamin C and succulent, so it's very high in water. And it grows in the desert as well as in the foothills. So if you're doing a long hike in an area without much water, you can eat a lot of these and replenish your water supply. The water in these succulent leaves, which you could squeeze the leaves and water comes out, they're very succulent, is also loaded with other nutrients like trace minerals. So stonecrop is another one of those fast foods that you don't gather and save for winter, but you do eat it while you're traveling because it's very, very common. And it's Sedum lanceolatum is the Latin name. Another plant that was used since about the 1850s is curly dock. Farmers and ranchers know it as a weed that gets into pasture or into a grass field, and it's sprayed these days with herbicides. But in the old days, it was hard to get rid of, but the Indians recognized it as soon as it came into the country as a medicinal plant because it resembles some other plants that are in the same family. So Rumex crispus is the Latin name of this. And remember, we saw another Rumex out in the desert. That was wild begonia. So it's used the same way as wild begonia. The roots were collected and made into a tea and drunk for what we would call liver contamination or liver congestion. They probably didn't use those terms in the native language, but it was obvious when people had skin conditions, they broke out in rashes a lot, had a lot of allergies, sometimes trouble digesting some of their common foods. You would treat them with the root of this plant, and often it made them worse. The skin rashes or pimples would get worse temporarily, and then they would clear up. That's how this root works. Contains a yellow acid called chrysophanic acid. It's an organic acid that causes the liver to dump fat. And the fat in the liver is where toxins are stored. Metabolic toxins as well as industrial toxins like DDT and herbicides that we use commonly on food that you buy in the grocery store. So functionally, it's very useful today. People tend to not use it, but herbalists recommend it. Chrysophanic acid in the form of ground up curly dock roots. And I have one here, I think. Let's see. Well, let's see where it is. Here it is. I don't have the root on this specimen, but it's a standard taproot. Grows about a foot long, and if you peel the outer bark off, it's yellow underneath. So you dry that root out and put it in sun tea. You put it in a glass jar. I use a gallon glass jug. Fill it full of water, put it out in the sun, and cut the root up into sections and throw it in there, about 2-3 tablespoons. I drink it every year because I have allergies, and it takes away my allergies to crested wheatgrass. It's very common pollen in the air in the spring. But this is what the top part of the plant looks like. And it resembles the wild begonia seed pods. And it's used exactly the same way. So this is another plant that became known as Indian tobacco. These seed pods could be stripped off of here, and they're very flammable, but they don't flame, they just smolder. So they'll turn red and let off smoke. And when you mix it with tobacco, it has a pleasant smell. It extends the life of the tobacco if you don't have much tobacco to smoke. And it kind of dilutes the tobacco, because wild tobaccos, as I said earlier, are toxic, and they burn the inside of your mouth if you don't mix them with something to dilute the intensity of it. So, medicinally, this is called yellow dock, even though technically the common name of this plant is curly dock, because the leaves are curly. The yellow root gives it the medicinal name yellow dock. So if you buy it as a tincture, it'll be called that. And it's very effective. It's something you can use for allergies. And a lot of people these days have pollen allergies or food allergies. So growing in the same zone, we're around 7,000 feet now, between 6,500 and 7,000 feet. Sego lilies become very common, and they're spotty, but in some places where the soil is more sandy, they'll become very abundant, and that's where people went to collect these Sego lilies. They're beautiful flower, petals are edible. I don't care for the taste of them, but some people do. What was collected, though, for storage was not the flower, but the corm at the bottom. And in this picture, you could see, if you look at the bottom of the picture, you could see an onion-like enlargement of the stem, and that's a corm. People refer to them as roots, so we can call them roots. It's okay. People dig these roots in large quantities with a digging stick. They're fairly deep. So traditionally, there were places you went to collect these, because if you went to a place with a lot of clay in the soil and you had to dig down a foot to get one of these corms, you could spend a lot of time digging in clay soil. So usually there were sandy areas in the bottoms of alluvial fans and along creek bottoms where there's blow sand. And Sego lilies like to grow in sand, and they're easy to dig in sand. So there were places where people went to dig these. You can see it looks just like an onion. It's a little smaller. Sometimes they'll get 1.5 inches across, a big one. And if you're in a good digging area in June, when these are flowering, that's the time that people went there and dug up large quantities of these. They're 100% digestible carbohydrate that was added whole into stew pots, like you would throw in little white onions or scallions, and a good carbohydrate source. Another good carbohydrate source, which is probably one of the major foods, including all of the foods, animal and vegetable, at the top or near the top of the list for Shoshones here in Wyoming and also in Nevada, is Yampah. Yampah comes from, it's an English version of the Shoshone word yombe, or yump. I'm probably not pronouncing it exactly right, but it's a Shoshone word that refers to this plant and the root of it, It's in the carrot family, and while we have this picture, you can see the typical carrot family flower head, which is an umbel. And all of the secondary flower stalks come together to one node on the top of the stem and form a flower head, and that's called an umbel. It's like an upside down umbrella. And that is a characteristic of the carrot family, which, as we said before, makes up a tremendous number of the plants that were gathered and stored for winter to make bread out of. So Yampah cakes were what fed the Lewis and Clark expedition when they went through North Dakota. They traded guns and metal knives and things with the Hidatsas and the Mandans in exchange for Yampah cakes, which were huge, preserved flour cakes of Yampah that could be broken off and made into flour and baked or fried into bread. So this is the whole plant kind of laying on its side. You could see that the root is really two roots that come together to the base of the stem. I think I have a close-up. You could see there. They're kind of small, but if you're in the right soil, you can dig up a lot of these. And regions of the West were named for this plant because the Shoshone and Numic-speaking people really occupied territory from southern Montana all the way down to to Mexico, actually. So their language was used to name places, and many places are named Yampah if you look on the map of Indian names. And that's because that was where people went to gather this root. It was so important that other tribes used the word Yampah. They traded for it because if you lived in a place where it was easy to collect Yampah and there was lots of it, you could easily trade it for other valuable items once you gathered these roots and dried them. You could store them in a bag dried and they last for years. They fresh, if you dig them up fresh, you can eat them like a carrot. They have a great texture and a nutty flavor. It's a delicious, wild, natural food eaten raw. But if you dry it and make flour out of it, it makes a really nice tasting biscuit. So this is not called biscuit root, but it's used in exactly the same way that the biscuit roots were used. And probably the most common carbohydrate in the food lexicon of the Shoshone people. So the Jackson Hole has a river running through it called the Snake River. And we'll talk about how it got that name later. That was named by the Army expedition that went through there in 1860. But prior to that, that river was called the Yampah River. And it was an Indian name that the fur trappers used. And because of a mistranslation in sign language, the Shoshones were living there, but the Army referred to the Shoshones as snakes because of this mistranslation of another plant name. So it became the Snake River. But it was one of the Yampah rivers. There's another one in just south of Rock Springs, Wyoming. The Yampah River runs through northern Utah, Colorado and Utah, and drains into the Green River, because that was another place where the soil was very good to collect this plant. So it's Periduridia gardneri is the Latin name for it. And if you go to Teton Park in about June on the highway and look to the right and the left through the flats there, through Antelope Flats, both sides of the road, you'll see a lot of sagebrush, but if you look between the sagebrushes, you'll see white, and it's the flower head of Yampah. That's just the dominant understory under the sagebrush there. And what's important to know is that The Park Service controls the Teton Park management, and they don't like fire there. But in pre-settlement times, fires would have been very common and caused a mosaic of open grassland and sagebrush in that area and all of the west. And where the sagebrush disappears, it leaves more water for Yampah. So Yampah would have grown there as almost a continuous overstory in burned over areas in the Yampah Valley, or what we call the Snake River Valley now. So it was very common. Tribes that spoke different languages would come into there to gather Yampah. It wasn't just Shoshones. It was such a great gathering area that it attracted Blackfeet and Nez Perce. Sheep eaters would come out of the mountains to gather Yampah there in the Snake River Valley. And other tribes. Grovants were there too. Oh, just one more comment about Yampah. There's a group of Shoshone, and most of the tribes named themselves based on either their habitat or what they ate. And the Shoshones mostly identified themselves as a group by what they ate. So the Eastern Shoshone call themselves Gwichandika, or the buffalo eaters. In Nevada, there was a group called the Yambedika, which is the Yampah eaters. That's how important this plant was. Their food source, of primary importance is how they named themselves. So here's another plant that was both medicinal and food. It's the wild geranium, Geranium viscosum. And there's two species of it. There's the blue or purple flowered one and a white flowered one. They're both used exactly the same as a pot herb. The leaves are gathered, leaves and stems and flowers, thrown into a stew pot as a vegetable. Very high in ascorbic acid, vitamin C, and also high in the B vitamins. So it's a nutritious plant, very abundant, very common. One plant like this one here is enough to fill up a stew pot for two people as the vegetable. And once you boil it, it has a pleasant taste. When it's very young, it also has a pleasant taste as a salad green that you could eat as a trail food. But once it matures, gets up close to flowering time, the taste can be strong. So geranium is related to the rose family plants. And most of the rose family plants that are herbaceous, like this, meaning it's tender, doesn't have any woody parts except underground, are used as astringents medicinally. So the root was pounded into a flour when it was dry, into a powder rather, not a flour. This wasn't cooked. But it was a powder that you could keep in a bag and sprinkle on an open wound that won't stop bleeding because it's a styptic. A styptic is a medicine that stops bleeding. It could also be eaten. It was used for several bleeding conditions like ulcers, internal ulcers, and bleeding, overproduction of blood when a woman has a period. So it's used for any kind of excessive blood flow. And that's true of almost all of the plants in the rose family that you find in the mountains. This is just one common one. There are probably, I'm guessing, 40 or 50 rose family plants that are used this way. Another common plant in this zone, although it does occur a little lower, it'll occur along streams down in the lower foothills, and it'll also occur up to about 10,000 feet in the mountains. And you get over 10,000 feet, this plant has a dwarf form that grows up to about 12,000 feet. It's called fireweed, and it is probably one of the most common vegetables that were collected for use as a pot herb, and that's the leaves mostly, but also the flowers. And it was also collected and dried, and it could be rubbed after the leaves are dried and stored as a powder that you would add to stews as a thickener. That's because the pith of the stem has polysaccharides in it that you can add to water that's warm, and it will thicken that water, even if there's nothing else in the stew pot. But sometimes you use a thickener to make a stew more appealing, and this was one of the two primary plants used as a soup thickener. And that's in the stem. So when you collect the plant, you would dry it and use both the stems and the leaves pounded into a powder. And there is one here. There's fireweed. This is not yet ground up or preserved, but these are dried and what they look like basically in the wild before you process them. You can see nice long entire leaves. These are kind of curled up now. These leaves and the flower head, the flowers are right here, that's one, but this whole flower head would be covered with purple flowers. Purple color is the color of quercetin. Quercetin is a purple antioxidant, and you can see in this jar, these are the dried flowers, which are still purple. So these are medicinal and were collected as a medicinal plant for very specific types of maladies. The leaves are also full of quercetin. They're not purple because the chlorophyll camouflages the quercetin. But when the chlorophyll disappears in the fall, and these plants stop using photosynthesis, the leaves turn the same purple color, almost a red color. And some people think that's how it got the name fireweed, is when you get a big patch of this that covers an acre or two, the red color looks like fire. And I don't really buy into that name. I think more likely they're called fireweed because after a fire, where forest trees burn down and the understory's all burned, the next year one of the first things to come up in response to the fire is fireweed. And you could see that in Yellowstone Park after the gigantic fires of 1988 in Yellowstone. The trees were burnt. They were black stands of trees, nothing growing underneath, and 2 years later it was almost a continuous forest of fireweeds, about 2 to 3 feet tall. So I think that's more likely the reason it got the name fireweed. So they're very edible. The leaves were the main part that was used for food, and the stems. If you collect the stems before they flower, just before they flower, the thickening saccharides that are in the stem are probably at their peak. So that's the best time to collect the stems for thickening soups. The leaves are edible anytime. They taste pretty good when they're young. They are no longer tasty when they're old, when they're flowering, but you gather them then to throw in a stew pot, and then they gain a better texture and flavor when they're boiled. So the flavor is not what really the high point of this plant. It's that it happens to be very nutritious and healthy. Quercetin is one of the antioxidants in this plant that make it medicinal. And for that purpose, it's used for fungus infections, such as candidiasis. Today, fireweed's used for candida yeast infections, which can be either systemic or local. In either case, it's drunk as a tea or used topically in the case of yellow toenail fungus, which bothers older people generally, or people who wear rubber boots a lot and they don't have good airflow through their socks. It's common to get a yellow toenail fungus. There are also fungus infections that are common with diabetics, and they're all treatable with fireweed and nothing else. You could use fireweed poultice on a toe and just keep changing the water every day. You can cover a toenail with a tea made from the leaves and put one of those finger covers on it. They're a little latex finger cover that are used to protect a cut or an injury from the outside world. And they fit on your toes too. And keep that tea in there with a little paper towel or cotton to hold the moisture against the toenail. And in about 5 or 6 days, the fungus is killed. Usually in a treatment like that, the native way to do it is to treat the topical symptoms with a poultice at the same time you drink the same herb as a tea, so you get it from the inside and the outside. And this is very effective for fungal infections, bacterial infections, and probably, since this was so common in Native American diet before the reservation, it suppressed or prevented bacterial and yeast infections from happening. So remember, food is medicine, and prevention is better than treating the injury after it happens. So it's probably true what some of the elders said before the reservation. People just didn't get sick very often. They didn't have very many medical problems until smallpox showed up. The roots also are concentrated in enothic acid, which is an antioxidant that's associated with the evening primrose family, which this plant is in. So when we saw the rock rose evening primrose in the desert, that had enothic acid in it that was used for skin injuries and as a suppository for hemorrhoids. This root is used the same way. It's used to treat skin cancers. Enothic acid has been studied clinically now and shown to suppress cancer growth. So the Indian method has finally been tested and proved in modern medicine. Well, the Indians probably using it for 10,000 years or so here. Fireweed is just a good plant. I eat it probably every day in my diet. It's possible to do that if you spend the time to gather it in the summer. You can use it all winter long. Very healthy, nutritious plant. One other thing that fireweed does, it's been subject to some very recent clinical studies, because medical researchers have been looking for some way to eliminate senescent cells, or at least remove senescent cells from the interstitial tissues, meaning these senescent cells are cells that are associated with aging. They're cells that don't die. Normally your cells have a lifespan, they die, they're absorbed by the immune system and eliminated. The one thing that has a linear relationship with all of the signs of aging in humans is these things called senescent cells that live through their lifespan, don't function any longer, but hang around and don't die, and they take up space. And for some reason, the increase in numbers of the senescent cells are associated with all of the symptoms of aging. The arthritic pain, the muscle loss, degeneration of the joints. All of these things associated with aging are also in a linear relationship with the buildup of senescent cells. Fireweed is one of the few things found that actually eliminates senescent cells. When you drink tea from fireweed or drink tea from onion skins, you get a fairly large daily supply of quercetin. And it's thought that quercetin is what is eliminating these senescent cells. So it is a new anti-aging, it's not a fad yet. I think it will be in a few years, but it's an anti-aging remedy. It's also used, fireweed tea is used on a daily basis by some athletes who know that quercetin allows your mitochondria to put out its optimum level of ATP, which is the energy source for your body. So if you're working out and you want to develop muscles, you need selenium to develop muscles, and you need quercetin to have optimum energy output for working out. So between gumweed and fireweed, you can actually build muscle tone to absolute optimum levels. So fireweed is made into a tea or it's a pot herb, we talked about that, but there's a special way to make the tea, and for a long time it was a real popular tea throughout the world because fireweed grows all over the world. And I suspect this is one of the ways that the Native American tradition would have made it. And it's very flavorful to do it this way. But these are the fireweed leaves as they look dried from the plant. But this isn't the way you make tea out of it. This is what you would put into a pot as a vegetable. The way the tea was made was the leaves were stripped off the plant. Well, first of all, the plants were picked. Some of these fireweeds are as tall as me. And about halfway up, if you grab the plant and you just pull it, it breaks off about halfway. And you take those and you throw them into a pile and you set them aside, spread them out, take them home, spread them out so they don't mildew. And you let them wilt for about 2 days. And then when they're wilted, the leaves are drooping and limp. They don't dry out. So you got to do this in a place that's not in the sunlight and not on a hot day. When they're wilted, then you pull all these leaves off 2 or 3 at a time, put them in your hand and you rub them. It's called rolling the leaves. And it takes about, I'd say 10 seconds, 10, 15 seconds to roll the leaves to where they're curled up around each other. And then you throw them in a pile and they slowly unfurl, they unroll. Not completely, but they are not in a tight bundle anymore. And then you take those leaves after about 2 to 3 days when they start smelling very nice, and you heat them up to 110 degrees or thereabouts. You could do that by putting them out in the sunlight in a place with no wind and cover them with something and they'll heat up. It doesn't take much to get them to 110 degrees. I put them in a Dutch oven, and the black Dutch oven will get to 110 degrees in sunlight, and that stops the fermentation process. So this is a fermented tea. And when it's done, it smells wonderful. And the leaves end up looking like this. They're black. Black. And so this is called black tea in Russia. It's also called Ivan chai, where it's still a popular tea in Russia. But it has a great smell, and when you brew it the way you would brew tea, green tea or black tea that's caffeinated, it would look similar and have a similar smell, only this is a little more fruity, especially if you have more of the flowers in it. But this is an extremely nutritious, healthy tea, and it's probably the way the Indians made it, as a refreshing drink. It's a nice taste, very healthy. And it's black, almost black, and it's called black tea. But that's the proper way to make fireweed tea. So here's another plant in the rose family. This is called Prairie Smoke in this area. It's sometimes called mountain avens or three-flowered avens. These individual plants have a flower stalk that comes up and then divides into three. And you get 3 flowers per plant. So it's Geum triflorum. Geum is the genus of the avens, yellow-flowered avens of the rose family. And this is the 3-flowered one. The root of this is medicinal because it's in the rose family. It works the same way as the other plants in the rose family as an astringent. You can peel off the bark on the root and you get down to a white core that's succulent. And you can lay that right into an open wound and it closes the capillaries and stops the blood flow. Very effective styptic medicine for bleeding. It can also be added to soups because it has a pleasant flavor, the root does, for somebody with diarrhea, because most styptics are also an anti-diarrheal drug. So this is another one that can be used that way. And since all of the members of the rose family can be used that way, we treat them the same as an emergency treatment. But if you're going to gather one to use as a tea for the future treatment of diarrhea or bleeding, this is the one that's preferred because it has a pleasant tasting root. And the others are not so pleasant tasting. They're more like medicine. The upper parts of the geums, of the avens plants, are all edible, so they're all pot herbs. Not especially tasty raw when you're eating the leaves, but if you throw them in a stew pot and boil them for a while, they taste good. And again, like many of these mountain plants, they're high in the B vitamins and vitamin C. So this is a plant that's common around the Yellowstone Park border, just traditional Shoshone country, eastern Yellowstone and inside the park and down into Teton Park. You can find this growing in mountain hillsides, and it is called coneflower. There are other plants called coneflowers. And this is not the same as Echinacea coneflower, but it works in a similar way. It's a mild pain reliever. It's used for arthritic pain by rubbing the plants fresh onto joints over the knuckles and the fingers, if that's where the arthritis is. It's used with other plants usually. It's called an old people's medicine, which means the arthritic and rheumatism pains that old people complain about, and I get sometimes. You just want some pain relief. It doesn't correct the problem. It's not a treatment for the problem, it's a treatment for the pain. So that's called a palliative medicine. So this is a palliative medicine just as a pain reliever, and it can be brewed up in a decoction where you put it in boiling water for a bit, set it aside, let it cool down. The next day you use that water as a rub on painful joints or old injuries. So it's coneflower rudbeckia is the genus. And we have a couple of species here, so we'll just use the name rudbeckia as the genus name. They all have this kind of flower head with a disc, but no ray flowers visible. There's the flower head, close up. And it's usually the leaves and stems that are mashed and used medicinally. The root is also sometimes used in a tea for toothaches and minor pain relief, because it is related to echinacea, which is used that way. This is a poisonous plant called Larkspur. It's in the genus Delphinium. We have about 3 species that are real common here of Delphinium, and they're all called Larkspurs. It's poisonous. You don't eat it. Animals won't eat it unless they're starving, and then it'll kill cows and sheep if they have to eat it, because there's nothing else to eat on an overgrazed range. But people gather it and dry it and powder it and use it for lice, because it kills and repels lice. So if you powder it and you have a kid that shows up coming home from school with lice in his head, in his hair, you can put that powder in the hair and even make a wash out of it with water and a plant called soap brush, which is Ceanothus velutinus, which lathers up into a soapy white lather, and then that'll hold it in the hair and leave it there for a while, and all the lice will die. So it's still used that way amongst people who know how to use it. But other than that, we don't eat it. It's very poisonous. And those are alkaloids that do that, called delphinins, that kill lice. So this is a picture of a bush. I'll have a close-up here so you can see what it actually looks like. But fairly large bush that could expand over 5 or 6 feet, maybe 7 feet overall width. Has shiny leaves and white flowers. And this is the soap brush that you make soap out of. And it lathers up for washing, but that's only when it's flowering that it does that very well. And that's when it was gathered. You could dry it and make soap out of it later on. There's a close-up of the leaves and the flowers. So both the flowers and the shiny leaves, when the leaves are shiny in the early summer, is when it's gathered to make soap out of. So some people called it soap brush. It was also called buckbrush. Crows call it elkweed. But medicinally, you can buy it right on the shelf in a health food store, and it's called red root. So the Indians knew that the root was used medicinally for congestive type disorders, where you can't swallow, your head feels swollen, you've got a headache, and you can't hear anything because your ears are plugged up. That's a classic case for red root, and it's usually associated with an ear infection or allergies. So red root is used for that. I make my own. You gather the roots. I don't think I have one here. They're very hard to dig out of the ground, but you dig up a big chunk of root, and then you use a hatchet or a sharp obsidian stone, and you start carving into the wood. And most of it's white, but occasionally you'll find a red section of the root. And it's that red part that you carve out of the root, and you make a tincture out of it. And I have a red root tincture here. This is red root that I made, and you just soak it in alcohol, the red part of that root, and you'll get a red colored liquid that you can take internally. And about 30 to 50 drops twice a day will relieve the congestion. It's also good for bronchial congestion. It mostly works on congestion in the head. I've also used it for people that had congestion in the lymph nodes, in the armpits, which can be bad if that lymph doesn't flow and you get swellings. It can be an indicator of metastatic cancer sometimes. So it's good to clear those places out. So medicinally, the root is used to enhance the flow of lymph, which is a way of getting rid of toxins. So if you're exposed to agricultural toxins, or you've been in bed for a long time and not moving, that's where you use the root of this plant. It's to stimulate the circulation of toxins to be eliminated from the body. The leaves are made into a tea, which we could make. This is the plant here, dried, and the dried leaves are taken off the stems and just thrown whole into a pot of boiling water, and you set it aside. As soon as it gets into the boiling water, you don't want to boil it very long. You want to just set it aside and let it steep for about an hour. It makes a wonderful tasting tea. So it was used as a tea to drink just because it tastes good. That's what I do with it. At least in some tribes, it was used to treat panic. Somebody that suffered some kind of experience where they can't get over the panic. Sounds like PTSD, but it's hard to tell when you read these old expedition accounts where the Indians described what they did with these plants. I have not had opportunity yet to use it on somebody that's suffering from PTSD, but it sounds like an herb that was probably used for that or for immediate panic. Say you've been chased by a grizzly bear and now you're terrified and shivering, and maybe that's what they meant by panic. That was another medicinal use in the written record of Indian uses for this plant. There were ceremonial uses. Many of the tribes believed and had names for this plant that indicated it attracted males. Like buckbrush, it doesn't say deerbrush, it says buckbrush. And elkweed, it was supposed to attract male elk that would eat it. So I don't know about Shoshone traditional use of this plant in this way, but I know Alma Snell talked about, she's a Crow woman who knew the traditional uses of many of the plants, said that elkweed flowers were used by women who wanted to attract a particular man as a husband. They weren't supposed to socialize in the old tradition, but she could have a friend put a flower that she had collected into the man's teepee if she was interested in him, to cause him to be attracted to her. So it's one of those uses that is hard to document in scientific circles, but there are many uses like that that are more on the spiritual end of things and the energy end of things. So we'll make some tea out of this buckbrush, and it'll just be a demonstration of how you make teas in general and what it looks like. There's a close-up of those flowers and the shiny leaves. This is another plant that, it's an interesting plant in that it's an evergreen, a broad-leafed evergreen. Not many of those in Wyoming, but most of them are broad-leafed evergreens only because of snowdrift areas. So this stays green under the snow. If you have a year where there's not much snow, all these plants die because they really can't stand real low temperatures. Gets to 50 below zero, it kills the plant. So they're totally dependent on snowdrifts to make it through the winter, and they'll stay green under the snow. but they are eaten by deer and elk, and they're a good food for them, especially late fall and winter feed, early winter before the snow covers them. They also come in and become the dominant plant after fire. So it's another one of those plants that can attract wildlife for hunting. Game animals will come in after fire to eat this. So fire was something that the native hunters paid attention to. Those were prime places to go to 2 years after the fire went through a place, because so many of the plants that started to come back are prime wildlife food. This is mullein in the distance. We don't need to talk about it much. It's a European plant, so we'll skip over it. Limber pine is another one of the plants near the top of the list of vegetation foods that were gathered not every year, but when they were in high production, because limber pine produces very edible, very nutritious pine nuts, but they don't produce every year. They'll produce every third or fourth or fifth year in a large amount, and then after a high production year, they usually don't produce anything. But in years that when they do produce things, and then they do produce pine nuts, they'll produce hundreds and hundreds of these cones on each tree, sometimes thousands of these cones on one tree. And the tree is a 5-needle pine. These are the white pines. It's a kind of a class of pine tree that has needles that are in a bundle of 5. So if I break off one of the bundles here, you can count them, and there's 5 needles. Sometimes there's 4 because one breaks off, but on average there'll be 5 needles in each bundle, and that's characteristic of limber pine and the other pine we have in the Wind River Mountains, which is called white bark pine. Both of these are the pine nuts of the eastern Shoshone. When you get down into Nevada and Utah, Shoshones used pinon pines, which is a different species, and they had 1 or 2 needles. But the limber pine here, this far north, was the primary source of pine nuts, which is an extremely high protein source and very readily available, an abundant tree in this area. The place they came to gather it was here, around South Pass, between the headwaters of the Sweetwater River and Rock Creek. Here is a place where there's a lot of evidence of camps, Indian camps, where they gathered the pine nuts from limber pine. And the way they did it was to find these pine cones before they open up. This is an opened up pine cone. And about the middle of September, when you have enough dry, warm winds blowing across these pine cones, they will open up like this and drop their seeds. And of course, it doesn't take long for the Clark's nutcrackers and the gray jays and the pinion jays to pick the seeds out of these cones. And then as soon as the seeds hit the ground, you have chipmunks and ground squirrels and regular tree squirrels, red squirrels, and even flying squirrels here, pick up the seeds off the ground. So they don't last long. The way they were gathered was before these cones open up, the seeds are all inside. They haven't fallen out yet. And the cones would be gathered up and put onto a big buffalo hide or a tarp. And then you just can sit there and let the cones open up, or you can put these cones around a fire to dry them out, and they'll start to open, and then you can shake them and the seeds will fall out. So that's probably the main source of pine nut protein, which is a complete protein. It means it has all 8 amino acids that are the essential amino acids. That makes it a complete protein. It's hard to find complete proteins in the plant world, where all the amino acids are there. If you eat other protein sources, many of the Indian rice grass grains or other grains, you have to mix different foods to get all of the proteins that you need to build protein in your body. But this is a complete protein, and the sheep eaters who did not adopt the horse and lived higher in the mountains where it was hard to get horses, up around 10 to 11,000 feet, used a different pine. This is another white pine, a 5-needle pine. It's identical as a tree to limber pine, but white bark pine has a different cone. It's called a serotinous cone, and it means it never opens up except when it's exposed to heat. So fire is what opens these cones. And that's a good plan for high elevation, high lightning strike area in the mountains, is to have serotinous cones where it requires a fire to disperse the new seeds into the burned over land. But what that means is the sheep eaters, the Dukadika people, were the Shoshone speaking group that lived in the mountains and did not adopt the horse, but traveled on foot, although they had domesticated wolves to carry things. They relied on this plant, and many of the sheep eater camps you can find in the mountains now that archaeologists are locating and documenting are in very dense white bark pine stands, and they think it's because this pine nut was a major food source for them. Pine nuts, when you extract the seeds from this kind of a pine cone, which is closed, you have to build a fire and throw them into the embers, and they'll slowly open up. And once they open, the seeds are stuck inside with a lot of sticky sap. And that means you can burn the sap off, but you got to be careful not to burn up the pine nuts inside. So there was a technology involved with this, but these pine nuts are delicious, and any pine cone has about 50 or 60 pine nuts in it. So if you invest the time at just the right time of year, which is in September, when these cones are fully mature, you can spend weeks doing nothing but just extracting these pine nuts and saving them for winter use. They were ground up into a mush that has a wonderful flavor and mixed with other foods. They were also put into stew pots as a thickener with a flavor, a nice flavor, or eaten wholly as roasted pine nuts as kind of a treat. So some of the western Shoshone call themselves the pine nut people in western Nevada, where the pinyon pines are very common. If you look close here, you can actually see some of the pine nuts. I pulled a scale off, and there's usually 2 pine nuts together for each scale. And that means if you look at these pine cones, there's 50, 60, or 70 pine nuts in each cone. That's a lot of pine nuts. But those are the little pine nuts right there. They're smaller than the pinyon pine nuts, but they taste the same, and they have the high protein content of pine nuts. Of course, pine nuts are one of probably the primary protein source for grizzly bears, And I hesitated because pine nuts are not produced every year. So in years when pine trees are not producing pine nuts, grizzly bears depend on insects usually as their protein, because grizzlies are primarily vegetarians and insectivores. We think of them as carnivores that kill animals for meat, but they rarely do that actually. They usually eat insects, and pine nuts is their primary protein. So for comparison, this is the limber pine cone we were talking about. See all the sap on it. Pretty common to have a lot of sap on these cones when they're ripe and ready to harvest the pine nuts. If you go to extreme southern Wyoming, just north of the Utah border, you'll find some Pinon Pine, which is highly sought after by Shoshone, and it was originally part of the 1851 Fort Bridger Treaty Reservation. Went all the way down to Utah border, and you can see this is a smaller cone than the limber pine cone, and it's more open, but this is the Pinon Pine cone, and the little seeds are right here, and they are bigger than the limber pine nut. So these are actually preferred over the limber pine as far as the pine nut itself. So down there in the southern part, the south of the Red Desert, this is a place they would have gone to gather pine nuts in the pre-reservation days. But also the limber pines in the Wind River Mountains would have been collected because it's common. But there were other pine trees that were used for other things. There is no Ponderosa pine right here, but Ponderosa pine does grow in the Bighorn Mountains and in eastern Wyoming, and Shoshone people would have used the pine nuts from this also, this Ponderosa pine cone. But you could see the long needles on this Ponderosa. So those were used for a specific purpose. There's a Ponderosa pine branch that's been it's been dried in confinement. So all the needles are pointing in the same direction. And these things were collected and made into brooms and brushes for keeping the floor clean in the teepee. Because for one thing, the needles are nice and long, but also when they dry out, they don't break. They maintain a flexible fiber. So to make a broom, here's a little whisk broom, a hand broom, but these could be made any size, depending on the handle you want to put on it. This one's about a year old, but they'll last about 2 years before they get brown and dry. And it's just a bunch of needles that have been put together so the length is about the same at the top and wrapped with willow bark. So these are really nice brooms. They hold together well, and they are good at cleaning dust and dirt off of a hide or a floor. So those, and here's another one. This is an older broom wrapped with willow bark. This one's already turning brown, and this one's about 3 years old. So that's about the time you pitch them and build a new one. But to do that, they had to go down into Utah or over into the Bighorn Mountains, because these Ponderosa pines don't grow in this area. And the other pine we have here is Lodgepole Pine. It's a two-needle pine, and it looks a lot like the limber pine, except the bundles are not in 5s, they're in 2s. And I don't have a specimen here, but the needles occur in bundles of 2 needles. And lodgepole, of course, is famous for what teepees are made of. That's why they call lodgepole, is because the teepee was called a lodge. And they tend to be very straight, even though the Latin name for lodgepole pine is Pinus contorta, which means it's contorted. In windy places and high elevation places, it can be very contorted and twisted. So Pinus ponderosae is the Ponderosa Pine, and Lodgepole Pine is Pinus contorta. And I think I didn't mention that limber pine is Pinus flexilis, because it also gets contorted in the wind and can bend over in the spring and completely bend in almost in half and form an arch and not break, because it's a very flexible tree. So here's another trail food, bluebells. Very common in the foothills zone. This is Foothills Bluebells, Mertensia oblongifolia. Wonderful tasting plant. It's great in a stew pot, but it's really a great salad green because it tastes exactly like string beans or green beans, and loaded with B vitamins. It's in the borage family, and some of the borage family members have vitamin B12, which is usually something associated with meat or with animal proteins. So some of these can have some B12 vitamin in them. Also lots of vitamin C and a wonderful taste. This is a close-up of bluebells. The crows did not eat this plant, the Shoshones did. The crows felt that plants with blue flowers were suspect for some ancient reason. We don't know why, but that's what some of the elders have said. But they did use it medicinally because there's a mucopolysaccharide in the leaves. These are very succulent leaves. If you rub the leaf between 2 fingers, between your thumb and index finger, it'll turn into goo. It's a mucilage that is high in mucopolysaccharides, which speed up the healing process. They are associated with allantoin, which doubles the mitotic cell division rate so that you can heal twice as fast. So these leaves were broken or rubbed and then put directly on a wound as a poultice and held in place with pine sap usually. One of the side uses for limber pine and the other pines is the sap was collected and mixed with the fat of deer or elk and made into a bandage called sonapi. Sonapi is the Shoshone word for a pine sap bandage. And they work really well. I've used them in the woods many times. If you mix an oil with the pine sap that's been heated up into a liquid and then you let it cool, it forms a kind of a high viscosity resin. And when you put it on the skin, it dries out and forms a pliable plastic-like bandage that's a complete seal over the skin. So that's one way to hold some plants like this with mucopolysaccharides in place to not only protect the injury, but speed up the healing rate of topical injuries. Mucopolysaccharides are also found in other plants, and we know now they are probiotics, or what's called prebiotics. That is, when you eat them in the diet, especially in the spring of the year, they coat your intestines with a medium that is optimum for bacterial growth of the friendly bacteria in your gut. So you want to have these things in your diet. The American diet is pretty much void of anything with these mucopolysaccharides in it, but native diets had lots of them. And the other plant we saw earlier was globe mallow that has mucopolysaccharide in it too. So these plants at different seasons were available to the native diet and probably promoted intestinal health that is missing today. Here's a pleasant tasting tea called Yarrow, Achillea millefolium. I think most books call it Achillea millefolium lanulosa to distinguish it from the eastern yarrows. It makes a very good tea. It's one of the best medicinal plants. So it was collected at the height of flowering, the way it is in this photograph, when the flowers are very white on top and attracting a lot of pollinators. It has a very medicinal smell that is a good smell. But it smells medicinal. It smells like it's opening up your sinuses, which is what it does. It clears your sinuses. It kills bacteria, pathogenic bacteria. It is a styptic, so it slows down blood flow if you have an injury. It treats diarrhea, and it's good at adjusting your blood to higher altitudes so that it's treatment for altitude sickness. All of these things in one plant is pretty remarkable. I think I might have a close-up of the flower there. It kind of looks like an umbel, but if you look close, a true umbel has all of the stalks of the flowers coming to one node on the stem. And yarrow doesn't do that. It looks like it's doing that, but actually the different flower stalks attached to the stem at different levels. It's hard to see here. So it's a false umbel. But these flowers are what you use for altitude sickness. The Chinese have yarrow, the same plant grows in China, and it's been revered for a long time as what they call the arch blood alterative, which is the way the Indians used it here too. Anything's wrong with your blood, you use this, sometimes in combination with other plants like sagebrush, to kill an organism that may be in the blood. And this to adjust the blood chemistry back so that you can get enough oxygen to breathe well. That's how the Chinese described it in their ancient literature. But the native people here knew how to use it in exactly the same way, but they didn't have writing, so it wasn't written down 1,000 years ago. Yarrow in Crow language is called chipmunk tail because the leaves look exactly like a chipmunk tail. I don't know if you could see it in these pictures. Doesn't really show up that well. But the tea tastes very good. It's a pleasant tea that you can drink when the flowers are blooming. And just a few of the flowers off the flower head in a cup of tea adds a tremendous aromatic flavor to the tea. So a plant that's not as common, but had another dual use is bee balm. Bee balm has a beautiful flower. So this has been domesticated in various forms. Some have red flowers, some have white flowers or pink or purple in the domesticated varieties. But they grow wild in the Wind River Range, usually in canyons, steeper canyons will have it close to a stream. And it's sometimes called wild oregano because the leaves taste like oregano. It's in the same family as oregano, and it's a wonderful spice to put into food. Dried leaves are also used medicinally to speed up healing. It's interesting that here we only have one species, which is Monarda fistulosa. And if you go to eastern Wyoming, there'll be two species. This one, Monarda fistulosa, and Monarda punctata. They look very much the same, but in eastern Wyoming, where the Lakota ranged, the Sioux, they made a very sharp distinction between these two plants that look the same, and we treat them the same. We call them both bee balm. But Monarda fistulosa was called Wape Washtemna by the Lakota, and they used that one for eye problems as a poultice. You put the heated up wet leaves on top of your eyes to heal any eye problem, including detached retinas and cataracts, things like that. But then the other one they called it by a whole different name. Yeah, they didn't group them together like we do, but the punctata was called Hehakata pajuta, which means elk medicine. And that was used for different things. It was used to speed up healing of skin injuries and taken internally for upset stomachs. So these fine distinctions we don't make today were made based on their medicinal use in ancient times by some of these tribes. I suspect that distinction might have been made by the Shoshones because they did go into the Bighorn Mountains and would have found both species, but there's no written record of it that I know of. This is one of those fast foods, shooting star. You can eat it as a salad green. It's very tasty when they're in full bloom like this. They're sweet. And you could throw them in salads or throw them in a pot as a pot herb and boil them. They're associated with feeling good, a good feeling from eating this plant. Shooting star is Dodecathian, and there's many species, so we'll just leave it as Dodecathian as the genus name for the Latin name. Kind of an attractive little plant. This is Bitterroot, another important plant. This is the flower of it, but before it flowers, it produces leaves that come out very early. It's the first root that's collected, usually by native people. The Salish people call it the first root, and they had a first roots ceremony in the Bitterroot Mountains, which were named after this plant in Montana, because that's where they would go to gather the roots. But the ceremony was done for all the roots they would collect throughout the whole year. But the first roots were the bitter roots, and that's where they did the ceremony. Bitterroot was collected. You can see the roots here, what they look like. They have a reddish bark on the outside, which is very bitter, and you peel that off. And you're left with a white root that's dried and then powdered and used as a thickener in soups and stews. It's kind of high on the list of Shoshone traditional foods. This is a juniper, which is important ceremonially. It's important as a food, as a spice rather, and as a medicine. I collected some here yesterday. It grows under forest canopy. So this is a creeping juniper, Juniperus communis. Juniperus communis, sometimes called common juniper. But this was the one that was primarily used for the berries. You can see these berries on the stem here. There's many, many, many green berries. And if you look close, occasionally there's a blue one. And there's a blue one. It's the blue ones that were used as a spice for strong tasting meat. So these berries were pounded a few times and then pounded into meat that had a strong flavor, like mule deer or antelope. and it offset the strong flavor with a pleasant sweet taste. Sweet but spicy. But only when the berries turned blue. I have some of the berries here in a bag. Let me put them out and you can see the difference in color. It's really important because you never take the green berries internally, but you can eat the blueberries. There's mostly green. There's a few of the blue ones. Blue ones are very nice spice. You could just chew on these while you're walking through the woods. Usually grow in the forest, under the forest canopy. And the green ones you save. You put them in your pocket. You don't eat them right away. In fact, you don't eat them at all. The green ones you use topically. So you can mash the green ones. They have a high fluid content when they're fresh. You can see the little goo that comes out there. And that's what you could put right on an open wound, because these the juniper and thuol, which is an oil inside of the juniper berry, kills bacteria. But there's too much of the thuol in these green berries to take internally because they're destructive to the glomeruli of your kidneys. So they can actually cause kidney inflammation. But the blueberries have less of the toxic oils and terpenes that are in the green berries, and they are actually a treatment for glomerulitis and kidney nephritis. So if you have itchy urination, juniper berries are one of the medicinal plants used for treating an infection of the urinary tract. These are some of the berries in the bag. The green ones are also full of these toxic oils that are very light volatile oil that comes out when you mash the berries or cut them in half. So they're thrown into boiling water. You boil it for about 20 minutes. And it makes a solvent for grease, which is why it makes a great shampoo. The juniper berry shampoo was used to keep your hair slick and shiny and smelling good. And especially if you mixed it with the buckbrush that we said we were going to make tea out of. When those leaves are shiny, you can gather the buckbrush leaves and chew on them and throw them into the same water with the juniper berries, and you have a shampoo that lathers up and smells really nice. So, juniper berries also contain an enzyme that stimulates peptic enzymes in the stomach when you eat the blueberries. So the blueberry, the blue phase of the juniper berry, was used for old people who had lost their appetite, or people who've been sick for a long time and you want them to eat a lot of food to get their strength back. It's an appetite stimulant because the blue phase of the berry stimulates peptic enzymes, which help you digest protein, and hydrochloric acid. And if you stimulate those two things in your stomach by eating 3 or 4 of those berries before a meal is presented, it will cause you to eat more. So the thing about these junipers, is there's many different species, but they're all dioecious plants, which means these berries, which are not actually berries, botanically they are called cones. These are primitive plants that produce cones, but they happen to have just one big scale instead of a lot of scales. So they look like berries, and they're full of water, so they act like berries. But they're actually cones, technically. They only occur on the female plants. So dioecious means of 2 houses in Greek. and that signifies plants that have males and females on separate plants. So all junipers are that way. And it's important to add that most native people call junipers cedars, because when the settlers came out here, they called junipers cedars, and that was the word that was used for junipers. So when you hear about cedar tea, they're really talking about juniper tea, unless you're on the East Coast where they actually have cedars. So cedar wood as an incense is actually juniper wood. Cedar fence posts are actually juniper fence posts. And cedar berries are juniper berries. So the females, like this, were used and collected for their berries. The males were used ceremonially. They were the plants without the berries on them to stand on during certain ceremonies for purity, because cedars are associated with purity and long life. And this is very interesting, because if you read enough about traditional beliefs worldwide, cedars or junipers, correctly junipers, worldwide are associated with those two things, long life and purity. So in purification ceremonies or purification rites associated with ceremonies, a spiritual leader will stand on creeping juniper, this one, this species. There's actually two species of creeping juniper, Juniperus communis and Juniperus horizontalis. But they're the ones that grow low to the ground. They rarely get above 2 feet high. Usually they're about 1 foot high, and they can spread out over 8 to 10 feet along the ground. And it's those plants that are collected and put in in front of an altar where you have ceremonies that require the spiritual leader to not make contact with the ground, but actually stand on something that is a purification plant. The tree junipers are the ones that grow tall. They'll grow 40, 50 feet tall. And they produce similar berries that are also used in the same way. The blue phase is used as a spice, and the green phase used to make a solvent for grease, and to make shampoo out of. You don't want to eat too many of the blue phase of any of the juniper berries, because they also are traditionally used as an abortifacient to cause an abortion. So it's not recommended to eat a lot of the blue phase of the juniper berries while pregnant. And in fact, the blue phase of juniper berries were traditionally used in many tribes as a contraceptive. So I have here a branch of the tree juniper. This is the one that is used most commonly for ceremonies where you smudge cedar. They call it cedar smudging. Again, it's a juniper, not a true cedar botanically, but so commonly used the term cedar that we use it. So these leaves here can be lit, and they will cause a lot of very sweet smelling smoke to smolder, and you can brush that on people as part of purification before you go into a ceremony, or before you pray, or before you have an important meeting where you want everybody to be thinking good things. These cedars junipers were also put inside of a teepee or at the entrance to a teepee to keep bad spirits from coming in. And this is the tree juniper. There are several species, but the one commonly used throughout this region by all of the tribes is Rocky Mountain juniper, Juniperus scapularum. That's this one. If we go further south, there's another juniper which does not smell as good when you burn it, so they don't use Utah juniper very often for smudging. It's Rocky Mountain juniper that's used for that, and that's this one. Utah juniper looks more like a broccoli plant. It's got very rounded branch ends. And this is more sharp or flat, scaly leaves. Some of these plants, and it's not in all of them, but many of these Rocky Mountain junipers produce a red wood, and they're sometimes called red cedar, not to be confused with a true cedar that grows on the East Coast called red cedar, but that's what's locally called as red cedar. I think you could see it a little bit in this one. Right under the gray bark is some reddish color. And if you cut into the wood on a big stem, you'll find these red streaks that run through it. And when they get really dark red or almost purple, they make the best incense I know of. And that could be burned. You could burn that in your house, let it smolder, and it's perfumey. It's a very, very pleasant smell. But it's only in the red resin that permeates the white wood of the Rocky Mountain juniper. Doesn't occur like that in the other junipers, like Utah juniper. I think I have a little bit of that red wood here somewhere. Let's see. Well, I don't know where it is. Well, maybe I don't have. Oh, here it is. This is a section of juniper wood, and you can see the difference between most of the wood, which is this tawny kind of yellowish white color, compared to the reddish color. And this is the incense part. And because we have smoke alarms in this building, I'm not going to light any of it, but you can light it with a lighter and it'll smolder and keep smoldering for quite a while and put out a very, very wonderful sweet perfume smell that'll permeate the whole room. So cedar is an incense, and again, when we call something cedar in Wyoming, it's actually a juniper. So an important medicinal plant that's also edible is kinnikinick, which is an Indian name. It's also called bearberry in the books. Bearberry is a plant in the heath family, and in Wyoming it's the member of the genus Arctostaphylos. If you go further south and into California, there are other members of that genus that form trees, but here this is a low-growing shrub. It rarely gets over 6 inches tall, and it produces red berries. Here's a dried specimen. You can see the dried red berries on it. And this is a fresh specimen I dug out from under the snow this morning. No berries on this one. The berries are a favorite food of grouse. So where you have a dominant understory of bearberry in an aspen grove or a pine forest, you're likely to have a lot of grouse there in the fall of the year. They love to pick all of these berries off. And sometimes, in some years, these plants will be loaded with the berries. They taste a little bit like apples after they have frozen, so this plant is sometimes called a little manzanita, which I think refers to apples. But the berries are only good to eat after they have frozen. Birds don't mind eating them before they're frozen, and bears don't mind eating them before they're frozen. But they only come into maturity about the end of August or beginning of September. And at that time, if they haven't frozen yet, they taste like a high-quality cardboard, but not really sweet. After they freeze, that cardboard, which is carbohydrates, will convert into sugar, and they'll actually have a fairly nice flavor. If you want to induce that flavor, you can pick these berries in early September, put them into a freezer, and take them out, and then thaw them and put them back in the freezer, and freeze them several times, and they'll convert into sugar and taste better. So that's the edible part of the plant. Where these plants grow in abundance, hunters will go to hunt grouse, ruffed grouse and blue grouse mostly. But otherwise, the leaves were collected and used for urinary tract infections. The leaves could also be ground up and pounded and used as a powder for topical infections, because there's a bactericide in here called ericolin. It's a drug. But ericolin and the associated chemicals related to ericolin, there's 5 or 6 of them, all work synergistically together to kill bacteria. So very good medicine for any kind of bacterial infection, but especially for urinary tract infections, because the ericolin-related drugs do not break down in normal metabolism. They are excreted through the urinary tract. So any infection in the kidneys or the ureter or urethra or the bladder will get exposed to these chemicals as they pass through the urine. And that is what kills the infection. So it's used for cystitis, which is a bladder infection, urinary bladder infection. And it's still used today. Naturopaths use it quite a lot for that kind of infection, and it has no side effects. So it's better than some of the drugs you would get from the pharmacy. So this is another forest-dwelling understory plant called Pipsissewa. It's also in the heath family, just like kinnikinick, bearberry. So it's used exactly the same way as bearberry. The leaves are used as a urinary tract infection treatment. So I think we'll skip that one. Now we're getting a little higher into the mountains, where we have a lot of forest, deep forest understory plants. These can grow into the foothill zone, but we're slowly moving into the montane zone too, so we'll have a transition here with some new plants. So in the upper end of the foothill zone, we're getting into some more elevated mountains, but we're still not into the high mountains. We have Arnica cordifolia, which is an anodyne plant. It's well known as a pain reliever. It's a topical pain reliever. It's not like echinacea that you take internally for toothaches or for general pain and systemic pain. but it's for topical use only because this is a poisonous plant. So Arnica, has about 5 species in this area. 2 of them are real common, but Arnica cordifolia with the very big heart-shaped leaves that are about 2 inches long was the preferred one, and the whole plant could be used to rub onto any kind of a pain, like arthritic pain or an injury, an old cut that gets infected. Those are the main uses for Arnica. And there are European Arnicas that are used for the same thing. There's one that's marketed as a tincture that's used for topical pain relief called Arnica montana. And most people think that it comes from Montana, but that's actually the European species that grows in the mountains of Europe. But this one is the one we use. It's sometimes gathered along with other plants as a vegetable because it grows alongside of things like miner's lettuce that grow in the mountains, and sometimes people harvest the same thing, the Arnica, along with the miner's lettuce when they are gathering a large quantity of leaves before it flowers. And there have been many people poisoned by that. It doesn't kill you, but it makes you nauseated for several days if you eat this plant. You shouldn't use it on open cuts because it can actually absorb through the blood and make you nauseated if you're sensitive to Arnica. So the next one is pineappleweed, which is our name for it because it smells like pineapple. Kind of like pineapple. Actually smells more like chamomile to me because it is a chamomile. It's an American wild chamomile. And it looks like this. It's in the sunflower family, but sunflowers are made up of a disc in the middle, which are usually the male flower parts, and then the rays, which we call petals, but actually they're ray flowers, and each one of those petals is a flower in itself. It's a female, a male. Females are in the middle, and the male flowers are on the outside, the rays. So this plant does not have ray flowers. It just has this central disc. And that's a distinctive way to identify wild chamomile, which we call pineappleweed. Matricaria matricarioides. And this had a lot of traditional uses. It works like chamomile in that it has azulene in it, which is a sedative. So you can use it to relax, to put you in a calm mood, or to go to sleep. So sleepy time tea is made from a European chamomile, German chamomile. But this one works the same way because the chemistry is the same as the European chamomile. And it's also safe. So mothers would use this for babies that they want to relax and go to sleep. And it's also a very sweet smelling plant. So one of the Shoshone names for it, I've been told, is Nua Nadega, which means Indian perfume. And it's very sweet smelling even after it dries. So I've seen Shoshone cradle boards where all around the baby, where the baby would be in the cradle board, are these little leather thongs, these little strings. And those are for tying on bundles of chamomile, or this pineapple weed. It's a pleasant smell to put in the cradle board because babies don't always have a pleasant smell on their own if they've been sitting in the cradle board all day long. So I've been told that's what all of those little strings are along the edge of the cradle board, is for pineappleweed. There's a string up on the top above the baby's head on the cradle board, and that, I've been told, is for a rose branch. And that's put there while that little opening is at the top of the baby's head before those sutures come together and close that hole. It was thought that bad energy could come in through that hole, and they put the rose branch there because it tends to keep away the bad spirits. That's just what I've been told, but chamomile was made into a tea just to drink, like a lot of these other plants that have a pleasant taste. But you don't drink it in the morning. It's an evening tea because it does relax you enough that you may want to go to sleep. The next one here is coyote tobacco. We have one species in Wyoming that was used by most of the tribes, Nicotiana attenuata. It's the wild tobacco, and it's very sticky when it's growing. It grows about 1 foot to 2 feet tall. It has a tubular flower with 5 petals, and at least some of the ethnobotanical interviews with people using tobacco indicated that it was the flower calyx that was used to smoke. The leaves had a use too. They were a pain reliever. It could be rubbed on injuries or arthritic joints to relieve pain. And sometimes the leaves were smoked also, but they were very, very strong with alkaloids that burn your tongue and burn the inside of your mouth. So that's why they were mixed with certain things to dilute the effect. And those are the Indian tobaccos. But this is the real tobacco, and it's in the same genus as the tobacco that is made into cigarettes and cigars and pipe tobacco today. But that tobacco that's cultivated comes from South America. It's not native to North America. This plant is native to North America. And I have one here. This is coyote tobacco. It has a pretty strong smell. It's a wilted one because I really collected this over a week ago. But there you can see the flower, and the part below the flower, although it's a little wilted, you can still see it, is the calyx. And that calyx right here is the part that was plucked off, dried, and smoked in Indian pipes. And some of the smoking pipes were actually just little tubes made out of either rock or one of the types of buckwheat that has a large hollow stem that was used as a pipe. Anyway, that's the wild tobacco. It's a very rare plant. There's some indication that tobaccos are rare these days because they require fire, and they come up the year after a fire, and then they disappear. And in the old days, there would have been a lot more spot fires that burned small areas from lightning strikes. And sometimes different tribes would actually burn areas to improve wildlife habitat, and that's when this tobacco apparently would show up. The leaves are very strong insecticide. They can be used to repel insects from around where food is. There's other plants that do that, like Monarda, the bee balm. So these are plants you could put on a drying rack where you have meat drying or fish drying on a rack out in the sun. And to keep the flies off of it, you can put wild tobacco there or bee balm. Sticky. So here's a plant that grows down in desert country, along rivers. It grows in the foothills of the mountains, and surprisingly we find it in the montane zone where it shouldn't be growing, but it does grow there in a kind of an isolated condition. And this is giant wild rye, or Great Basin wild rye. And I'll explain why you find it in the mountains. It's about as tall as me. It's got seeds that are edible, like almost all the grasses. It's just hard to get out of the chaff, so it's rarely eaten as a grain, except as a survival food. And then these grains are thrown into a frying pan or heated somehow and then pounded to break the chaff away from the grain, or they chew on the grain and spit out the chaff. But it's not like wheat or barley that separates from the chaff really easily, so it's not a food that was gathered often. But it was used for several things. For one thing, it's a plant that animals won't eat normally. Elk, deer, antelope don't normally eat this grass. It's not appealing to them. But they could eat it. It's a food that could keep them alive. And the fact that they don't eat it means it's always there. In the summer, when there's plenty of other grasses and forbs around to eat, these wild animals will eat everything but this. And it's a tall plant. So it was highly valued as a food for wildlife and for horses, because horses don't like to eat it that much. But if you have a tough winter and the snow is deep, sometimes this is the only grass that comes up above the snow, and horses can eat it and animals can eat it. So after the Shoshone got the horse and the Crows got the horse, Lakotas got the horse, they like to camp in areas where this wild rye grows, because if you get a lot of snow in the middle of winter and the horses can't paw down to the small brown grass, they can eat this and get through the winter. It's a survival food for animals, grazing animals. So winter camps were places generally where this grass was in abundance, just in case of a bad period of heavy snow. Some of the other uses for it is the big leaves that come off the bottom of the plant have very microscopic serrated edges. There's actually little hairs that come off the edge of the grass. And I don't have a fresh grass blade here because it's April and these haven't come up yet here. But those blades of grass on this species of Great Basin wild rye were folded over into a loop, and then that loop was used to scrape the inside of the eyelids where people were in dust storms or working in a dusty area, and sand particles that are very small can get in under the eyelid and cause inflammation, little pimples. And these blades of grass from this particular wild rye were used to scrape off that inflammation. It's so widely reported used that way by Shoshone people that it must have been a common problem. And I can imagine it was if you were outside all the time, all summer long, collecting plants in a place like Wyoming where the wind blows. Probably got a lot of sand and dust in the eyes, and this was the way to remove that inflammation. So it's a sharp edge, but flexible enough to get in under the eyelid. But there are stories about this plant, and this is probably, best we could tell, the grass that was used by Shoshone people and ended up being their name. It ended up being what the Army called them, because before the horse probably, and for the entire history of the mountain Shoshone, the sheep eaters who never used the horse, this was the grass that they put on the outside of their lodges to shed water and make a windbreak. And it works very well that way. If we had a green one here, I could show it a little better. But when the leaves are on this bundle, the leaves have hairs on them that are microscopic that point up. And when it rains or you have a mist, it'll fall on those leaves, and those hairs tend to accumulate water into droplets, and then it'll fall down into the middle of the plant and water it. But if you turn the bundle upside down, those same leaves shed water and they flow away. So these bundles were put on the outside of the mountain lodges and probably used as thatching before the horse, when buffalo hides would be more scarce, as the outer coating, kind of like shingles on the outside of a teepee. And that's what seems to have been the case, except a lot of tribes use bundles like this to cover their shelters. But the Shoshones apparently had a way of weaving the bundles, because one of their archaic names was the Woven Grass Lodge people. And this was a name still used in Idaho in sign language when the Shoshone were talking to the Army, and the Army was trying to learn sign language, so there were many confusions until the 1880s, when there was actually a book written by an Army officer who was commissioned to study and document the sign language. So from what he wrote, and what seems to be the case with the trappers describing the sign language, when Shoshones described themselves, they would say in sign language, "I am Woven Grass Lodge," which is how they called themselves, the Woven Grass Lodge people. Word for woven is this, grass is this, and lodge is this. So Woven Grass Lodge is approximately how it would have been described, and it was interpreted incorrectly as snake, which is this. This part of it is woven, but this in sign language is snake. So the Shoshones became known as the snakes, probably because that misinterpretation of sign language. And it was all about this plant, which they wove into a tight bundle, and if they wove it, it was more wind resistant. So the Shoshones in this area had woven bundles rather than straight bundles that the other tribes used. It became their distinctive feature. That's how I understood it, and I read that book on the Indian Sign Language that the Army commissioned, and it seems to hold true from the comments made about how the Shoshones described themselves in sign language. Oh, back to this woven grass of this particular type of wild rye that grows very tall. I mentioned that it occurs in the montane zone up to about 10,500 feet in the Wind River Mountains. And it's now known why this grows there, but it's always associated with mountain Shoshone villages that were very high. And they built these villages there in pine nut areas where the whitebark pine grows, and also where mountain sheep had grazing areas and nursery areas for their lambs. So that's where they liked to camp, because they ate mountain sheep. They were called dukadika, or sheep eaters. And they ate a lot of pine nuts from all the evidence that's found in the archaeology. There's one distinctive camp up on Whiskey Mountain that has about 800 lodges. And some of those lodges go back thousands of years. So this was a very old, high elevation village, and it's quite renowned as the largest high elevation village in North America. Rich Adams was the archaeologist who wrote that up and made many of the discoveries there. But around the shelter rings, where you had a flattened out area on a hillside where a mountain lodge was built. They looked like teepees, but they were made out of 7 and 8 inch aspen logs. So it was more like a log cabin that was permanent. In that circle are these remnants of Great Basin wild rye, and normally would not be growing at 10,000 feet. But it was growing there obviously because that's what these shelters were covered with, this wild rye, because it sheds water and it's a good windbreak. So now this grass, this species of grass, this wild rye, is what archaeologists look for to find more of these high elevation mountain Shoshone villages. It's a disjunct grass growing away from its natural habitat because it was brought there and the seeds fell out in the ground and it started growing. All right, now we can move on to Fracera speciosa is the Latin name for green gentian, and this is a laxative. In many areas, it's the first plant that a grizzly bear eats when he comes out of the den. And instead of eating the top parts, he will dig up the roots, throw the top part away, and chew on the roots. And it's a very potent laxative that is thought to clean out the gut of a bear that's just been hibernating for 4 or 5 months. So it's a good way to clean out. And the native people in this area often used it as a laxative and copied the behavior of the bear, because at least in several of the interviews that were done in the early days of the Army coming out here to survey the land and talk to the native people, they would ask the Indians how they got to know all of these medicinal plants. And sometimes the response was from our teacher, the grizzly bear. And that was probably one of the ways that native people learned how to use some of the medicinal plants, was watching the bears, who are relatives in a way, in a lot of tribal thinking. Because all animals are their relatives, but the bears in particular shared food habits and shared some behaviors, like they go into a shelter in the wintertime. So there was this belief that the bears could teach the people things. So this was a laxative that was used in the tribal sense as a spring medicine, marked the transition between the dried, preserved foods of winter and the new crop of green vegetation that came up in the spring. And in between, you would take this laxative to clean your gut out and make it ready for the new year harvest. It's a interesting plant in that it does not smell good. It smells kind of like rotten meat, and that's for a reason, because its main pollinator is flies rather than bees and other bird pollinators. Well, this is a medicinal plant that was often used for infections, and it's called goldenrod. This is Missouri goldenrod, Solidago missouriensis. Fairly common in the foothills of the mountains. Can grow in very extensive thickets in the wetter mountains like the Tetons. And the pollen from this was often collected and saved in a pouch for when you had a cut or some injury and abrasion that you didn't want to get infected. You could just sprinkle that pollen on it. But the whole plant is antibacterial, so even the leaves were collected and used that way. And the leaves were also a pot herb that could be put in as a vegetable in cooking. The remarkable thing about this particular antimicrobial plant is it's very effective against fungi. So today it's used for yeast infections pretty commonly, candidiasis. Now this is an edible plant called chickweed, Cerastium arvens. And in some places on mountainsides, it is the ground cover. So it's real easy to gather large quantities of the flowers and the little leaves and throw them into cooking. So mouse ear chickweed is the name of this. This is horsetail. There's two species in the genus that horsetail is in. They were both used about the same way. First of all, these plants were used to rub on wood to polish it, to make it smooth. So some of the handles on rattles and things that were made ornamentally were rubbed with this to make the wood have a glossy sheen. And it was just because it's a real fine abrasive material. It's monomolecular silicon dioxide, which is the finest sandpaper you can get. So you could shine up things, and it was used to shine up metal. When the Indians got metal from trade, they could shine brass and gold and even iron on a pipe, for instance, with rubbing it with this. So we use it today to clean pots, because you can scrape off some crud that's been on the inside of a pot for years and get it to shine by rubbing this horsetail on it. I have a little horsetail right here that's dried. So there's not much of that, but it's saved this way to make tea out of. And it's used for kidney infections and bladder infections. Tribal use today is still used for any kind of kidney problems. Itchy urine, trouble urinating, pain in the back, that's in the kidney region. But it's also used as an old people's medicine. There's a lot of those, but in this case, this plant seems to aid in the recycling of calcium. And it's calcium recycling problems that cause a lot of the old age symptoms, like osteoporosis and joint pain, weakness in the joints. So this was thought to be a tea that could help with that. And it does have a fairly high calcium content. So this is the species that's called Equisetum arvens. And it's got all of these fine secondary leaf-like structures that come off the main stem that make it look like a horsetail. So equisetum is the Latin name which means horse bristle. And that's the Latin they used for horsetail. The other species looks like this, and this is Equisetum hyderale. It's actually different species. People used to think it was the same species, but one was male, the other was female, or a different growth form. But actually, they're two different species, and they're both used exactly the same way. These are sometimes used as ornamentals, especially where they grow in a wet climate, like in the Tetons or in northern Idaho all the way over to Washington. They can get quite tall, 4 feet tall, and they're kind of a very nice, intricate structure that you can look at, and there's fine details that make it an ornamental. These plants, just as an aside, were growing in exactly this form about 200 million years ago. I think that was the Ordovician period, and they were around 200 feet tall, and they were like trees. But there was a lot more oxygen in the air then, and things grew bigger. But we have fossils of them that big. So now we're a little higher in the mountains. We're entering the montane zone where fir trees and spruce trees are more common.